So, ja, ich habe heute die Ehre, den ersten Akteur des Tages vorzustellen, der wahrscheinlich auch den längsten Weg hierher zurückgelegt hat, um heute bei uns zu sein. Mit 9 Jahren aus Kuba in die USA emigriert, lernte er sich schnell mittels Zeichnungen auszudrücken und entdeckte das Kommunikationspotenzial von Illustrationen. Bekannt ist er unter anderem durch seinen individuellen und provokanten Stil, mit dem er auch politisch Stellung ergreift. Heute zieren seine Arbeiten die Cover diverser Magazine, unter anderem des Deutschen Spiegels oder des New York Times Magazins. Ich will nicht zu viel vorwegnehmen. Wir freuen uns, ihn heute bei uns zu haben. Ein herzliches Willkommen an Edel Rodriguez. Dankeschön.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me, Cologne. Or Cologne, I'm sorry. All right, so I have a lot that I want to get through, and I've got my stopwatch on. I'm going to start with a little introductory video about some of my past work, and here it is.
I'm Richard Hayes, 618, 35 degrees right now in New York.
My name is Edel Rodriguez. I'm an artist. I'm originally from Havana, Cuba. I grew up in a small town called El Gabriel, about an hour south of Havana. I came here during the Mariel boat lift in 1980.
The governor of Texas, Bill Clements, says the president has literally opened the floodgates, placing no limitations on the number of Cubans entering the United States.
The downside of it was really my family missing who we left behind. There was a lot of anxiety and angst about family. And at that time, we didn't really know when we would see them again. And that was scary and very difficult. And then I didn't return to Cuba until 1994. That was a big shock, you know, because 14 years later, I arrived in Cuba, and it was 10 times worse than how we had left. That's when it hit me. Wow, my life really did change completely because my parents took this turn, this decision to leave. This is a series of actually Cuban science fiction books that I've been doing. So they're trying to introduce Cuban science fiction into the United States because Cuban science fiction does a lot of things where they hide and they talk about what's happening in society, but through science fiction. And they did that through the 80s and 90s. And it's getting picked up here in the United States. So they asked me to do the covers for it. I drew for fun as a kid, you know, not that seriously, but when I arrived in the US, it became kind of like a communication tool sometimes. Like if I didn't know how to say something, I would draw it for my teacher or for someone in class. This is a map of the United States. So as you can see, Texas, Florida. So it's a map inside about 10 or 15 cigar boxes. I grew up with my grandfather smoking cigars, so I just like how that feels. I like the smell that comes from the boxes, and sometimes I use them for my artwork. And this was a map that I was asked to do by Amtrak. Coloring is something that I always had in my work that I think just came from my culture and my background. The colors that I used were very strong and very saturated. I never thought about it. That's just the way I see things. That's the way I do things. Studying fine arts, you're not told what to do. You're told you have to figure out what you want to paint. And then that's when you start thinking more about your identity, where you come from, where you might get ideas from. And that's when I started thinking more about Cuba and using it in my artwork. On my work, I'm very aggressive and very direct. I'm not going to sit back and just accept what's happening. I'm going to fight with what I have right now, which is my work.
You're looking at live pictures out of Charlottesville, Virginia. This is where violent clashes have broken out between white nationalists and counter-protests there.
You had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest and very legally protest because, you know, I don't know if you know, they had a permit. The other group didn't have a permit.
This was most recently on the events in Charlottesville. I had shown him with a KKK hood in the past, and every time I did it, I'm like, oh, am I going too far? Oh, let's see. But at this moment, I was like, no, like, that's it. He is a racist. I'm gonna put the hood on. And I sent it to the editor of Der Spiegel, and they agreed. And you know, they called it the true face of Donald Trump. The same week, I was hired by Time magazine to do one on the same story. This image of a neo-Nazi with the American flag, this was all over the press as well. When it's on the cover of Time magazine, you have to talk about it. It sits on your coffee table at your family's house for a week. You see it on the newsstand. You have to talk to your kids about this when this shows up. So that's why I do strong covers, because I want people to have conversations, and that's the point of magazine covers, is to start conversations and get people to deal with the facts.
So, as a little background on my work. What I want to get across in this talk is the idea that these things happen, this sort of internet activity and this, the viral quality of my work comes from a very personal place, from a very personal point of view and a personal history. And I'd like to encourage all the students here to tell their own story, to talk about themselves, and see where that takes them, see where that takes their own work and their own career. So I want to tell mine. This is when I was about 5 years old in Cuba. I became very fascinated by the revolution, even as a 5-year-old. And that's me dressed in my uncle's military uniform. And this is me in my school uniform, where they would dress us as Che Guevara, basically. I grew up with many posters around my town, propaganda posters such as this. So when you're 5 years old and you see, you know, something that says socialism or death, it makes a big impact on you. This is me at my home. My father, this is my father here. He was very fascinated by the West, by United States, by Europe. And at some point, they couldn't bring any media into the country. But he got his hands on some German magazines. And he decided to rip out all of the advertising from the magazines and wallpapered the entire back of our house with magazine advertisement. So this is the first time that I really became that close into graphics and design. These are German cars, beer, etc. This is my family in our family's house. And of all these family members, virtually no one is in Cuba anymore. Within a year, most of us had left Cuba. Part of the reason was the dictatorship. It was very oppressive, not allowing people to speak. If you were against it, you were with it, either with it or against it. And at some point, my father and my parents decided that they didn't want me to grow up there anymore. So we left Cuba during a moment in a country called the Mariel boat lift. This is us in our boat, and that's me over there in the little red jacket. At some point in my career, I was able to meet photographers who had left Cuba on our boat. There were journalists that were working, American journalists that were working in Cuba, and they were thrown out of Cuba. So they landed on our boat, and we took them back to the United States. And these were all photographs that were taken by about 3 or 4 photographers that were working for various newspapers on our boat. And many years later, I met them through my contacts, and they looked at me and they said, I actually think I know you. I knew you about 15 years ago. And they brought me all of these slides and all these pictures of myself on this boat ride, which to me had always been a blur. This is me about to arrive in the United States. So overnight, I as a child went from something like this, from these kinds of graphics, into America, and to these kinds of graphics. So you can imagine the mind of an 8-year-old, how quickly these sort of imagery start blending in your head. And my fascination with American rock and roll became this. So we started doing concerts for our family, for our brand new immigrant family in the United States. We would do Kiss concerts, Rolling Stones. We would take boxes from garbage cans and we would paint them to look like the band. The symbols were hubcaps from cars, and I grew up in Miami as a teenager, and then I went to New York City. I studied at Pratt Institute in New York City, and my main focus was painting and illustration. So from these cardboard boxes to these cardboard boxes. So this is my studio now, and basically this is what it looks like: a lot of paintings, a lot of design, some sculpture. One of the main parts of my career has been poster design for theater, operas, Broadway shows in New York City. And as you can tell, there's a very big influence of Cuban colors and Cuban poster design in my work. But the main focus of my work, and what I'm talking about here, is magazine covers. I've created about 150 different magazine covers. The first one that had made a big impact that I noticed about 15 years ago now was this cover for Communication Arts. And they were doing a story on Cuban art, and I decided to be a little mischievous because I knew that the magazine was going to be sent to Cuba and to the Cuban poster community. So I had this idea, and I sent it to the editor, and they loved it. And I ended up making the artwork. It was the highest selling issue of Communication Arts. So that's one point where, one of the many points where I've taken a risk and saw the results. And the results is that this got one of the biggest internet discussion groups going. It was taken to Cuba and sent around to people in the design world, and they would put it in bags, in paper bags, to hide it, because they couldn't be seen with it, and they would like pass it off to each other. Did you see what is on the cover? Because this was very, you couldn't do this in Cuba. You couldn't really publish this in Cuba. Another risk that I took was the idea of confronting terrorism or confronting extremism about 3 years ago. I saw what was happening in Syria and felt that I had to say something, the way the extremists were taking over the country. So I created this series of posters critiquing the way they handled things, the way they would behead people and take selfies with these beheadings. I wanted to shock the New York public, so I made this image and I started spreading it online. So these images became very viral on the internet. Another thing that was viral at the time was the bucket challenge. I don't know if you remember that, if it was a big deal here, where people were using buckets of water and wasting their time on the internet, dousing themselves with water, while at the same time people were being killed in the Middle East. So I thought one way to get attention is create a bucket of blood, and this is what I did here. So the concept was get this kind of imagery out there, get it in the media, and hopefully I would start getting some assignments on it, and I did. This is an op-ed for the New York Times. And then I spread the message further onto street posters, such as this. And this illustrates my point, that as things are happening behind you, you're too busy on your cell phone or watching movies, and this man was standing there for about half an hour, not realizing that poster was behind him. And I had an exhibit of all this work in 2015, and here's the poster for it. But at some point, I started seeing the connection between what was happening in Syria, in the Middle East, and what was happening in America, the extremism of America. And I started making this connection visually between the extremist imagery and the terrorist image, and then bringing it over into the U.S. And that in the U.S. is the third rail. You can't touch that, comparing Americans to extremists. But I felt that it was a risk worth taking. And I started getting involved in the primaries, in the election, and making imagery about what was happening right before our eyes. So before every debate, I would make an image, a bit of a prediction of what was going to happen at that debate. And that was one. I saw Trump as a clear danger from the very beginning because of my history with dictatorships and my history growing up with Cuba. I really saw him as the danger that he's turned out to be. I was making these images about 2.5 years ago. And this type of work started spreading online. A lot of art directors follow my work. And my concept or my idea was to get this sort of in the bloodstream of the media so that they would publish imagery that was as strong as I was making. You know, I can make anything on the internet and put it out there. But what I was trying to do is to try to get the media, which has millions and millions of followers and readers, to publish this way. I know that the media always wants to be balanced, to show both sides in a balanced way. And I don't feel there's a way you can be balanced with fascists. You confront them. So at some point, Time magazine decided they wanted to go there, and they did. They called me. They said, "We love what you've been doing. We follow your work, and we want to make a very strong cover about how Trump's campaign is melting down." I created this cover, and it was a very big sensation in the United States because for the first time, Time magazine was taking a stand against a very, what I would call an insane or a brilliant man, depending on where you stand. Then there was a follow-up to that cover, which is called Total Meltdown. And this is when he had stated that he would grab women. No politician had ever done that or said that in the United States, so everybody figured that's it, it's over, he's gonna pull out, no more Trump. So they wanted to show him as a puddle. And this is the one that I created. This was the cover of the year that year. And this is an example of how it spread virally through internet, through television. It went. These kinds of things were so strong that they went everywhere. You know, this woman painted it on her fingernails and sent me a picture. Someone put it at their restaurant. And since that was happening, I figured, well, let's squeeze this a bit more. Let's get more juice out of this idea. So I started painting posters. And these were all stencil posters that I made. Made about 100 posters and started distributing them around New York City and in Miami and many different cities. These are some photographs of the posters out in the wild. This is at Trump's hotel in the lobby. So what's that, wrist number 4 or something? So I showed up there at like, 1 in the morning and there's no one around, and I left it on the coffee table and left and got out of there. And I was wondering what would happen when someone, sits down at the Trump hotel and would see that. I took these to Times Square and got some volunteers to pose with them. And then these were then put online. So all of it is sort of this circle. You work in reality, you work in the real world, you show your work, and then you put it online, and it becomes, even more. This was the first cover for Der Spiegel. And then this cover, as you remembered, before I had done the terror image, right? At some point, Trump had banned all Muslims from coming to the United States, and I was very upset about that. So I simply took that image of the terrorist and put Trump's head on it and put it on my Twitter feed. It went very viral, and then the people at Der Spiegel saw my Twitter account and asked if they could publish it on their cover, and they did. So once this cover came out, it was just on the internet one day, and then the next day it started appearing at protests throughout America, throughout the country. This is in New York. This is in Denver, California. This is in Florida. And even here in Germany, this show. So then I became a bit of the story because of my immigrant story. It started becoming that the immigrant child was taking on the President of the United States of America, which was a brand new thing for me. I had camera crews showing up at my studio. I was asked to be on television shows. And then again, I started to try to spread the story. This was in New York City. I posted this poster on a street in the East Village. And once I was ready to post another one, I was surrounded by a bunch of cool-looking young people. And the cool-looking young people asked me what I was doing, and I said, I'm just posting some posters. And they said, oh yeah, we're the police. So the police pulled me over and started asking me questions, and said I couldn't post these posters because this is private property, etc. And I said, okay, well. So I was about to get arrested. We talked for a bit, nothing happened. And then right when I was about to leave, one of the cops, the policeman, asked, hey, can I have a copy of that image? So I signed a poster for him because he requested it, and he wanted to show it at his police station in New York City. And then here's a few more images and posters that I've created. Trying to take the idea even further. And always kind of pushing and pushing. Pushing so much that even my mother, when she saw this image, she was very mad. And she called me and she says, how could you do that? You know, you can't show the President of the United States naked. So I made a new image. And I called my mother and I said, Mom, I put some clothes on him. And then the idea is, once you establish that brand, is how far can you push that brand? What can you do to surprise people? And I started seeing him everywhere and thinking he could go on anything. And this is a concept that I have in mind, to create peach stickers. And how can you stretch that brand? And how can it become so many other things? And that was the cover for Time magazine. These are the two images that I did after Charlottesville. And the same way, I started creating posters, putting them on the street in New York City, and then expanding on the idea that white terrorists in the U.S. are just as terrorists as everybody else. This is a look at my sketches for Der Spiegel cover. This is another cover. And it also became an ad campaign. An ad agency in London reached out to me to create a campaign for renewable energy, and treating renewable energy as taking on Trump. So this is that campaign. Renewable is unstoppable. That's how it looks from inside the train. And then here are some photographs from protests. The images have been disseminated throughout the world, and whenever there's a protest, the images come up. I offer them for free for people to download and print and bring to protests. And these are some of the pictures from all of that. And this is as a result of all that risk, as a result of all that, I've been involved with U2 in their concert tour, and they've asked me to create. I've created about 60 protest posters, and they've been shown at all their concerts in the United States and in Europe. So here's a clip of all of that.
Love hurts. Now you're the girl who's left with no words. Your heart's a balloon, but then it bursts. It doesn't take a cannon just to pin your skins. No covering and resistance. Love has got to fight for its existence. The enemy is armies of assistance. The amorous, the glamorous, a kiss, a fist. Listen to this song. Get out of And Lincoln's ghost said, get out of your own way. Get out of your own way. I can sing it to you all night, all night. If I could, I'd make it all.
So there's an example of taking risks, and something great usually comes out of it. Thank you.